Good day and welcome to the Citrix Virtual Hackathon. My name is David Cottingham. I'm the Director of Product Management on the Microapps service here. And what I'd like to do is give you a brief overview, probably about 20 minutes, about the basics of the service architecture, how we talk to it and how we extend it. So let's see what we get to. Now, many of you will have seen some kind of demo of the Microapps in the Citrix workspace. What we're doing is connecting to a system of record, something like Concur or Workday, and magically it appears we're creating these notifications that come into a user's feed in their workspace, enabling them to be more productive and hopefully to be much happier as well. But the question is, if you like, how do we achieve this magic trick? How do we get these rabbits out of this proverbial hat? Well, a bit of a warning here, and this is courtesy of XKCD. I feel a bit like Ms. Frizzle here because she gets asked by her pupils, hey, how do batteries work? And they go on this magical journey, through the rainbows and so on, and they end up here, where it's really quite prosaic, really. They Google Wikipedia batteries, and lo and behold, it comes up with the right answer. So I feel a little bit like that because some of the things I'm going to tell you are actually fairly obvious. But hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have a good idea in, if you like, the groundings of the Microapp service and hence what you can go on to do with it. Let's talk about some basic terminology, number one. So system of record, the hat that you saw, that's pretty simple. And an integration. Now, system of record is something like Workday or SAP Concur or Salesforce or your own homegrown thing. And then integration really bridges the gap, you like, between Citrix Cloud, so the Microapps service, and a system of record. And so you can think of it as basically an API bridge. Now, an integration obviously needs to have Microapps associated with that to be useful to anybody. We'll talk about what those are in a minute. So here's Citrix Cloud. Citrix Cloud is today a nice blue fluffy cloud, and obviously we have a thing that is the UI that we get served up to our consumers down here, and we have systems of record like Concur. Now today, if you want to go to Concur, you probably open a web browser and the user goes to it directly. Now if you're using Citrix Virtual Apps, you might open a published browser to get to it. But what we want to do now is construct microapps that provide a few of the use cases of Concur from within the workspace directly. So how do we do that? Well, we have this microapps service and we have the notification service which pumps those notifications into the workspace UI. So far so good, but of course you'll notice there's this gap between the system of records, so Concur in this instance, and talking to the microapp service. Well, guess what? That's where an integration comes into play. That's the thing that speaks SAP Concur's API on the right there and the relevant API to the Microapp service on the left. Great, so we've worked out that we can connect to a system of record, but of course, what notifications do we want to make anyway? Why does anybody care? Who should we send them to? All those sorts of things. Well, let's get started on that. Supposing we have Stella, our friend Stella here, is going to submit an expense report for office supplies for $2,300. Well, that's great. Now, supposing there is, with apologies to Scott Adams, a pointy-haired boss, and our pointy-haired boss doesn't want to receive all the notifications. Because remember, what we're going to say now is that we're going to have these expense reports submitted for approval to a whole group of people. So not just the pointy-head boss, but a whole bunch of other people could approve as well. It's a problem. Stella submits one of these, I don't know, every month. And there's a lot of them. That's unfortunate because the pointy-head boss says, I'm too important for this. I don't want all these notifications. Only send me ones over $10,000. Well, how do you do it? Because a system like Concur, you get all or you get none. It's not a kind of, hey, which ones do you want? Good news, what we can do is use our own event engine. Now, we're pulling in data from each of these systems of record, like Concur, and we put that data in a cache. And on that cache, we run an event engine which works out for example, what things have changed, and of course, what types of notifications individuals want. So you can do the pointy head boss only wants events or notifications for expense claims above $10,000. So that's all good, but the bottom bullet point there, we need to cache the data. And that's super important because instead of relying on pushed events from other systems, we pull all the data in. So what data do we pull in though? Well, we only pull in the data which we regard as active, and you can determine, or you can decide rather, as an administrator what data you regard as active. It might be, for example, that you only want to pull in active holiday requests from Workday, or possibly also ones from the last 6 months, but you don't need ones from 10 years ago. Similarly, for Concur, you might say, well, I only want expense reports that are up to 3 months old, plus all the active ones. And you can do all of that to ensure that you only pull in the data that is at all relevant to event generation that is for Microapps today, rather than trying to pull in all time from ServiceNow, for example. And having pulled in that data, which is active, you can then generate events and you can push them out to one of the channels that users can subscribe to. So something, for example, like Microsoft Teams. So how do we read that data in? Well, you've got SAP Concur on the right there, you've got our integration, and you've now got a Microapp service bubble there that's delivering notifications down to the bottom right. First thing to notice is that we have a service account that's reading stuff in. The reason it's a service account, well, it has to read data for every user that you're going to generate notifications about, and therefore you want one service account that has enough privileges to be able to see all the data. Note that it is read-only, not writable, but it has to be able to see all the data that you wanted to extract. That gets pulled into our cache. The cache is obviously encrypted on a per tenant basis, and as we just said, it has only the active data in it. It's not all the data that exists for all of historical record in your system of record. And of course, we then generate those events and notify the users. So how do we pull in the data? Well, we have what we call full synchronization and incremental synchronization, as you can see in this screenshot. Full synchronization is probably going to be something that you do once a day, and incremental is what it sounds like, just the updates to that. You might do that every 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the system and what volume of changes you expect. Those little triangle buttons, you can force synchronization on demand manually as well. Just remember though, because we're doing periodic synchronization, it means that the cache, by definition almost, implies a non-real-time system. That's super important when you're talking about how long it takes to deliver a notification to an end user. Now, cards, when they are generated, well, we just said that if they approve something in Concur, that's all very well. But of course, what happens to this notification in Workspace? Well, never fear, because the approval can come here, they might go into Concur, they might approve it. Well, that's okay, because magically on the next incremental synchronization, then the card will be removed, because of course we can then tell that this particular expense report has been approved. So fear not, yes, it is a cache, but we do the sensible thing about updating it and making sure that you don't have cards that don't make any sense anymore. So once you have your data, you can use Microapps to do useful things with it. We've got data in the cache, we can generate events, but we also might want to trigger events too. Before we go into that, what actually is a Microapp? We talked about it a lot, but what is it? Well, a Microapp is, well, you can read it there really, but it's a single use case, it's a single workflow. It is not trying to re-implement an entire application. It is simply about trying to get one particular use case done. Now, what does that look like? Well, some of you will recognize what one of these is, and when presenting this to a live audience, I always enjoy getting people to guess, so I'll give you a minute to think about what it might be. Those of you who've been to Japan will recognize this as the control panel for a Japanese toilet. And trust me, when you're confronted with one of these at early in the morning, you wonder what button you shouldn't hit. But what are we trying to do? What's the button you actually want to push, most likely want to push when you use the facilities? Well, the answer is, of course, the flush button. And the reason I put this up here is super simple. You're not trying to re-implement every button on the control panel. All you're trying to do is take the one or two most important use cases from your system of record and create microapps to enable those in the workspace. Don't try and re-implement the whole 100 functions of the system of record. That's not what we're trying to do. It's about making people more productive with those 2 to 3 use cases. So what are the elements of Citrix Workspace? Well, here is a notification coming in, and this you should be very familiar with by now. Great notification. Here is a notification with a button. And of course, if you have a button, then guess what? You can take an action, like approve. And over here, well, we have things, actions you might want to take that aren't necessarily attached to a notification that comes in. It might be an action that you want to take off your own back, like submitting a holiday request or submitting a quick expense or creating a ticket and so on and so forth. When you open up, when you click one of those cards in your feed, you probably end up with something like this. It's a blade that pops out. Similarly, of course, in this case, we're creating a quick expense, so a blade pops out with a form to fill in. These contents here are what we call pages, and pages that can be multiple pages linked together with buttons at the bottom. And the idea here is that you are creating the workflow in the workspace to do something interesting. So when we talk about microapps, a microapp has notifications, possibly buttons, but then when you open them up, you probably have pages in that blade. Now, we talked about taking actions. Well, funnily enough, when you take an action, you are writing data back to the system record. So remember, we talked about reads before. Now we're doing writes as well. So let's talk about how we do that. When you write data, you've again got the same components we talked about before. So the write back now comes from the bottom right there. The user's clicked a button, goes back to the Microapp service. That then tells the integration to write back to, in this case, SAP Concur. In this case, though, the user that we use is different. And the way that works is instead of the service account that we had before, we're now using a per user concept. So in this case, we're using OAuth, but a way to obtain the authorization of each and every user who we're going to write back on behalf of, that we can act as them. And so authorization is really, really important here, where we allow the user to tell SAP Concur in this case that the Microapp service or the integration within there is allowed to do those write backs in the context of the user. And of course, the reason that's important is because we want to have records written back to Concur as David, not as Citrix Microapps service. Don't know who that was for auditing purposes. Now, once we've done that, we have to worry about race conditions. So why is that a problem? Well, imagine the scenario where I have submitted my $2,300 expense at time equals 0, and it has an expense ID of 123 because all good things have ID 123. Our incremental synchronization happens a little while later, so that's when we pull the data from the system record into our cache. Great, well that's fine, except that suddenly unfortunately that number hasn't come out, but unfortunately that number has been updated to 100,000. That's a slight problem because at time equals 10 in the system records, in this case Concur, it now exists as 100,000. But you know what? The last incremental sync meant that we got 2,300 into the cache. So we've generated a notification that says $2,300. So I come along and I decide to click the approve button for expense 123. And of course that goes click all the way back through Microapp service, all the way back through the integration, all the way back to Concur. But what does it approve? Did the $100,000 expense get approved? Or was it 2,300? Or indeed what happened at all? Well, good news, good news. When we do that, the system of record checks, or sorry, we check that the system of records record hasn't been changed. And so we look at expense ID 123 and we say, hey, is the amount still $2,300? And if it is, that's fine. But if it isn't, we surface an error and we create a new card that says, something changed. Let's go back for approval again. So you do have to be aware of these race conditions because, as we talked about before, it's not a real-time system. Now, we talked about actions a little while ago. Now, people don't just respond to notifications, they also kick off workflows. And so those are, of course, another source of write-backs to the target system. So creation of a ticket, obviously, you hope, creates a new ticket on the target system. So what does that look like? Well, you know what? We've got all sorts of integrations. We've got all of these out-of-the-box ones. We're creating more. That's great. And of course, those involve reads and write-backs. Now, we're building lots of them, but let's face it, we know that the first question many of you are going to ask, or many of your customers are going to ask if you're a developer, is, well, what about my system? I want one. Can I have one? Can you make one for me? This is where you, as a developer watching this presentation, come in. So what do? Well, here's Citrix Cloud. It's stopped being a fluffy cloud and it's more sort of L-shaped. And our L-shaped cloud still has a cache and it still has the Microapp service attached to it. Here's a target system. Now our target system is a system of record, and hopefully it's one that speaks JSON over HTTPS. There's plenty of ways of doing that. Many of them will be REST based, some might be GraphQL and so on, but the point is it speaks JSON. And if it does, that's great because we can plug that into our generic HTTP integration. And what that allows you to do is configure that integration with the authentication details and so on, and what headers it needs to communicate, and what JSON fields that we care about to put into the cache, and so on. Now, the first critique that you'll have there is, well, my system record doesn't speak JSON, it speaks something else. And indeed, there will be plenty of legacy systems, or very custom systems that may also be legacy, that don't speak JSON over to HTTPS. Fear not. The point there is that we now need some kind of wrapper. And the wrapper is something that goes around the API or whatever it is of the target system to convert it to something that speaks JSON. Now, another sort of rock that you might be throwing here is, hey, but that means I have to do a huge amount of work to convert all the APIs to JSON. It's ridiculous. What are you talking about? Remember back to our Japanese toilet control panel. You're only trying to do this for 2 to 3 use cases. And therefore, the API set or subset that you have to, if you like, convert or wrap is actually going to be, hopefully, much smaller. So yes, you do need a web services wrapper. That's, done deal. Can't do much about that. But number one, it's an additional opportunity as a developer if you're running a business. But if you're not running a business and you've got to do it, then the good news is you don't have to do it for the whole API. And indeed, you could do it incrementally as you added more use cases ported, if you like, from the system of record into Workspace. So let's finish up. Hopefully this has been to the architecture of the Microapp service and how we can extend it. But let's talk about, if you like, what we've told you. So number one, Microapps provide only a fraction of a system of records functionality. You remember back to the Japanese toilet control panel example, but also think about how you use a photocopier. Most people only use the green button. And in the same way, what you're trying to do as a developer is to implement Microapps that are in support of perhaps 3 to 5 or maybe 20 if you're looking at a very complex system. That number of use cases, you're not trying to re-implement every use case of the system record. And to do that, well, you've built your Microapps, but to make your Microapps do anything useful, of course, you need an integration that allows you to connect those systems of record to Citrix Cloud in order to pull in the data and indeed to do the write backs. And when you pull in the data, just remember it's a data cache, it's incrementally synchronized, and therefore it's not real time. But because of that, we can run an event generator on the cache, and hence we can do things like only send the pointy head boss approvals for over $10,000. In terms of security, Remember that a service account is used for reads. That service account can read anything, but for writes, we do them in the context of the user, and we achieve that using each user authorizing us to act on their behalf. And the final one, well, we have the HTTP integration for systems that speak web services APIs, so JSON over HTTPS. Of course, many of those will be REST-based systems. And for other ones which aren't supporting JSON over HTTPS, well, you'll need to wrap those in something that bridges between a REST API and whatever the target system speaks. With that, we're done. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.